Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Red Lines. Iraq's parliament has voted to expel U.S. troops from the country. The decision came during an emergency meeting held in response to the U.S.'s assassination of a top Iraqi military commander late last week. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the deputy commander of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, was killed in a U.S. strike which targeted him as well as Major General Qassem Soleimani, the head of Iran's al-Quds force. While the Iraqi parliament's vote is non-binding, Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi has already said he believes the 5,200 U.S. servicemen currently stationed in his country should leave for good. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of mourners greeted the remains of Muhandis and Soleimani across Iraq over the weekend. Millions more took to the streets in Iran. Late Saturday night, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted out a series of threats to Iran, even suggesting he would strike Iranian cultural sites if Tehran dared to retaliate against this latest U.S. escalation. To discuss the targeted assassinations of Soleimani and Muhandis, I was joined from Tehran by Professor Mohammad Marandi. He teaches English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Professor Mohammad Marandi, thanks so much for making time in your busy schedule today to speak with me. I wondered if I could first get your reaction to President Donald Trump's latest tweets, even threatening to destroy Iranian cultural sites. What did you think of that?
Well, when Trump a few months ago threatened to obliterate Iran and wipe it out completely, I mean, that would also include cultural sites. So it's not really anything new. He's just being more specific now. And when he imposes sanctions on women and children, and when the U.S. government tries to prevent Iran from importing medicine, or tries to block countries from exporting grain to Iran, you know, this sort of language is to be expected from such a person. He's inhumane, he's barbaric, and but you know, he's not different from the previous U.S. administrations. I mean, Obama imposed similar sanctions against Iran, targeting women and children, and Obama, by helping Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar and others to bring in tens of thousands of extremists into Syria to destroy the infrastructure, but also the cultural sites and the cultural heritage of Syria, which, you know, is home to an ancient civilization. There's no real difference between the two, at least in my eyes. But
and
Trump, one of the good things about Trump, if you could put it that way, is that he's more honest. Although I understand that he is a serial liar, but he's more honest about his intentions, his hegemonic ambitions for the rest of the world. Obama puts it in a way as if he's doing the world a favor. When he's strangling the Iranian economy and punishing women and children, he says it as if he's doing us a favor. But Obama helped Saudi Arabia destroy Yemen. I mean, it's no different from Trump. But in any case, it is ugly what Trump says. But at least the world sees him for what he is, and that is an ugly, nasty character. But in the case of Obama or Clinton, not Hillary, her husband, they were more sophisticated about the crimes that they carried out.
And can you illustrate for viewers what the internal reaction within Iran has been over the past few days since news of Major General Soleimani's assassination? What has been the government response and the feeling in the streets among average Iranians?
Well, you know, it's interesting because if you listen to the Western media, and especially, and I mean the mainstream media, and the American media, and the Saudi and Emirati media, the Islamic Republic of Iran is unpopular, it is despised, it is evil, it is corrupt, it is incompetent, it is imploding, and, you know, the rest. But if you just look at the images that came out of Tehran today, out of Iran today, for the funeral, this man, General Soleimani, is representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The crowds were amazing. And this wasn't these two cities that they took his body to. These are two smaller cities. These are nowhere compared to the capital of Iran, Tehran, in size. Tomorrow we'll see the crowd in Tehran. It will be in the millions. So if Iran is so if the Islamic Republic is so evil, and if it is so bankrupt, and if it is so corrupt, then why are people so emotional about the murder of a general who is, from the, if you accept the Western narrative, he's symbolic of suppression and everything that is evil about Iran. So the Western narrative, at least for those who are curious, should be seriously questioned. And then the same is true about Iraq. We've been told that Iraqis hate Iran. They hate the popular mobilization force. We've been hearing that for 3-4 months now. The Iraqis want the Iranians out. The funerals yesterday that were held in Iraq, they carried his body and his Iranian companions alongside the Iraqis from Qazvin to Baghdad to Karbala and Najaf. In these 4 cities, again, millions of people attended the funeral. So, and then the CNN goes and shows like 100 people or 200 people somewhere in Baghdad celebrating his death. Of course, these are the former Ba'athists who supported Saddam Hussein. These are ISIS supporters, and they're people who work for American NGOs. They say that Iran is despised, and they showed like a couple of 100 people celebrating, but they don't take into the millions, at least let's say hundreds of thousands of people who were mourning, who were carrying an Iranian general on their shoulders and the Iranian flag. So Iranians are outraged that the Americans have committed an act of war. The US government has committed an act of war. Iraqis are outraged that the United States has committed an act of war against one of their own commanders, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He is the deputy head of the Popular Mobilization Forces. He was assassinated alongside General Soleimani. So what the Trump regime has done is that they've united the Iranian population, made them more determined to stand up against US imperial ambitions. And the same is true in Iraq. So, the irony is that what has been achieved by Trump is uniting Iranians and Iraqis and uniting them with one another. And today we saw the Iraqi parliament call for the expulsion of the US forces. That's something that would not have happened if this attack hadn't taken place, because the Americans have been bullying and pressuring and threatening Iraqi MPs for a long time now. But now they've been forced to accept the public demands. They're under pressure. So the majority voted for this. So I think what Trump has done, ironically, is that he's hurt American interests. And by carrying out these murders, he's actually strengthened Iran and Iraq.
Let's talk about why these funeral processions have been so large. Soleimani's impact stretched far beyond Iran and even beyond his recent victories over the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Can you give us a brief picture of who he was and why he was revered by so many across the region?
Well, first of all, General Soleimani was a war hero. When Saddam Hussein invaded Iran with US and European support, and Soviet support, he was a volunteer. He fought for the whole 8 years. He survived chemical attacks, the chemical weapons that the Europeans gave to Saddam Hussein, the Americans gave to Saddam Hussein. So and he was a war commander. So he was very highly respected. He's very humble. So when he goes to Syria, Iraq, Iran, he's always, you see all these soldiers taking selfies with him. He never wears, he usually doesn't even wear his uniform. So he's very much liked. He's a man of the people. Even in the war zone, there's a lot of footage where he's on the battlefield. They shoot at him. he's in the front line. He's not somewhere way back and giving orders. In Syria, despite the American rhetoric, and you know this as well as I, the Americans, the Saudis, the Turks, the Qataris, they were all supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all the extremist groups in Syria from early on. I mean, I don't want to go into the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012. You know this better than I do. You know, the WikiLeaks documents, Biden's speech at Harvard in 2014, and the list goes on. It's all coming out now that the Americans knew from the beginning that the extremists that had the upper hand in the fighting, and they support, and they made a willful decision, as General Michael Flynn admitted on Al Jazeera, to support their allies in creating a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq, which turned out to be ISIS. So when the Americans, the Saudis, the Turks, they had brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters into Syria, and they were approaching Damascus, it was then that Hezbollah came in and General Soleimani came in with troops from, or advisors from Iran, later troops as well, and so on. So the Iranians see him, as well as people in the region, people in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, as having saved their country from the extremists, from the black flags of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then when Iraq was about to collapse, the same Iraq that the Americans destroyed through sanctions and then through occupation, and of course the Americans, by creating this monster ISIS, which had, you know, there was a broken Iraq that couldn't resist it, the spillover came into Iraq. ISIS was about to take Baghdad. So Soleimani, General Soleimani, was sent to Iraq. So he led the defense of Baghdad. If it wasn't for him, Baghdad would have fallen. So people see him as the person who had the most important role to prevent ISIS and Al-Qaeda from taking over two of the most important capitals in the Arab world, and two capitals of civilizational significance as well. I mean, these two lands, Damascus and Baghdad, these two cities, these two areas, have a heritage lasting many thousands of years. So Iranians also, so people believe that he helped save them from ISIS, and Iranians believe that he saved Iran from ISIS, because if ISIS and Al-Qaeda had taken these two countries, then we would be fighting ISIS inside Iran as well. But of course, Iran completely against the Western narrative that he's, you know, that he's some sort of monster. But ironically, Trump once upon a time said that Iran is fighting ISIS, and that, you know, we should let them continue fighting ISIS. Trump himself once said that Trump created ISIS. So, but now all of a sudden, he goes and murders General Soleimani, which is, you know, an act of war, as I said earlier, and says he killed, I don't know how many millions of people or whatever.
Well, we hear constantly about these so-called Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq, and what seems to be lost in corporate media, Western media, is that these Iranian forces are actually invited by legitimate sovereign governments. And so in that sense, they're different from the presence of, for example, U.S. troops. Yesterday, when we spoke, you described Soleimani as an anti-imperialist fighter. What does that mean in the context of the region? I know, for example, I think he also fought in Lebanon against Israeli aggression.
Yes, he was key in the resistance to the Israeli regime when Israel invaded Lebanon and took Beirut in 1982. You know, they continued to occupy Lebanon until the year 2000, until they were forced to withdraw it. He was at that time leading the support, Iran support, to Lebanon and to the resistance to push out Israel by the year 2000. And in 2006, when Hezbollah attacked the Israelis to take prisoners inside Lebanese territory, because there's a small part of Lebanon that's still occupied by the Israeli regime, they took those prisoners so that the Israelis would be forced to hand over the over 100 Lebanese prisoners and the many dead bodies that they were holding. So they took them as an exchange. So this was a part of the Lebanese resistance. And even now, the only reason why Israel doesn't attack Lebanon is because General Soleimani has supported Hezbollah to build up defenses, which has so far kept the peace. So the irony, of course, is that when you listen to the Western media, it's as if Iran is attacking Israel or Hezbollah is attacking Israel, but all the conflicts between the two sides has been Israeli acting aggressively, Israel taking land, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Syria, and the other side resisting. But when you look at the Western media, it's the opposite. It sounds as if it's the Israelis who are the victims. Sort of like when the Israelis are bombing Gaza and there are like 1,000 Palestinians killed and 5 Israelis killed, and the Western CNN and BBC and everyone says the two sides are killing each other.
Or you hear about the one bottle rocket or something that fell on the other side of the border.
Yes, exactly.
Separation fence, but
they go into an Israeli house and talk to the Israelis, and they speak of their fears and their fear for their children, as if like there's no comparison, but they try to create some moral equivalence, because sometimes they can't blame the Palestinians because it's just so outrageous. So they make it a sort of he says, she says.
Mm. We also are hearing from Western politicians and corporate media pundits that Soleimani was responsible for repressing Iranians domestically through the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. What was his role in terms of domestic Iranian affairs? It appears as though he's someone who's been outside of the country mostly.
Well, again, this is the whole narrative. I mean, mm-hmm. He murders pregnant women and he hangs children. That's how that's the narrative on Iran. How repressive it is. If Iran is so repressive, if it is so evil, why is it that it's such a growing threat? I mean, the Americans and the Europeans can't have it both ways. On the one hand, Iran is collapsing. It's incompetent. It's corrupt. It's falling apart. Is hated, the regime, as they always say, is hated by the people, but it's a growing menace, it's a growing threat, it's a threat to the world. They can't have it both ways. Mm. I mean, you have to be quite effective and efficient, and you have to have a lot of support in order to be a growing threat to the world. I mean, we're the Nazis or the Americans or, I don't know, some other imperial power. We have to have something to be able to carry out our atrocities, but but the thing is that this has a lot to do with Orientalist narratives. This reservoir of knowledge of Iran, this Orientalist knowledge, it's since both sides, even though this is inconsistent, these two narratives, but this is not something that people see usually, because they say, well, yes, Iran is evil. Okay, that sounds right. Iran is incompetent. Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. These Iranians can't be efficient and smart. And then Iran is a growing threat. That sounds right too, even though these can't be combined together. But since it's just negative, they don't question the logic of all this. So General Soleimani, I mean, if the Revolutionary Guards are so evil, then why do we see these huge crowds in Iran pouring on the streets and people grieving and openly weeping about this general? And Iranians get more Persian language TV and media outlets information from outside than from inside. The Western governments have funded so many anti-Iranian TV channels. BBC Persian, VOA Persian, another channel called Manoto, then Iran International, which is Saudi, Deutsche Welle, Euronews, all sorts of channels beaming in anti-Iranian propaganda day and night. And BBC Persian is, I mean, even though I'm not a big fan of the narratives of BBC World Service, but BBC Persian is sheer propaganda. So you have all this negative information coming in day and night about how evil Iran is, how evil the Islamic Republic is. So this is not North Korea. I mean, I've never been to North Korea, but let's assume that everything they say about the country in the United States and the Western media is absolutely true. This is not North Korea. People in Iran are well informed. So you see 1 million people pouring onto the streets in the capital of a province in Khuzestan. More than 1 million going onto the streets in Mashhad, the capital of another province in Iran. And then tomorrow, I would assume millions of people will be on the streets of Tehran. So if the guards are so bad, if the mullahs, as they like to call them, I don't know where all these mullahs come from. I mean, most of the bureaucrats in this country, the military, they're not clerics or religious figures. But if they're so bad, then why are these people coming on the streets? This is something people have to start thinking about. That maybe Iran is not this crazy land that they've been, told all these years.
And speaking about having it both ways, it's hard to see how someone could be so busy killing U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Syria and Iranians at home. That narrative alone doesn't even stand up to logic.
That takes a lot of hard work. And another thing is, they talk about Iranians killing Americans in Iraq. I mean, they deny Iraqis agency. The Americans occupied Iraq. The Iraqi people are resisting occupation. So do the Americans really believe that the U.S. invasion of Iraq turned out to be a failure because of the Iranians who are on the other side of the border, who obviously are hated by the Iraqis? So on the one hand, the Iranians are hated by the Iraqis. On the other hand, it's the Iranians that are killing the Americans. And that's why the Americans were defeated in Iraq. That's why they had to withdraw their troops. None of this makes sense. But since all of this falls within, as I said, that framework of that knowledge, that reservoir of knowledge of evil, negativity, Orientalist traits, even though they're inconsistent and they're paradoxical. It's an irresolvable paradox. But still, many people at least, they don't see these inconsistencies, and they just accept what they hear in the media.
I'm wondering, what has been the political impact of this assassination domestically? Has it emboldened forces who say the Iranian government, should take a harsher line against the United States?
I don't think it's emboldened any particular segment of society, because from what I've seen, this outpouring of anger and emotion in Iran comes from all the different political persuasions. Mm-hmm. There are no 2 camps in Iran or 3 camps. There are many camps. It's a very diverse society. Iranian politics isn't divided between some conservatives and some reformists.
We always hear hardliners and reformists. That's all we ever hear about.
And interestingly, in Iranian politics is very different from Western politics. So, for example, the so-called conservatives, which are very broad and different from each other, they are leftist, economically speaking, but they are more family-oriented, family values. So in a certain sense, they would be more similar to the right in the United States. But with regards to social justice and economics, they're more to the left. The reformists, on the other hand, and the reformists are a very fragmented spectrum like that. As I said, there are many camps. There are no 2 camps in Iran. It's a very sophisticated and complex society like many other societies, maybe like all societies. But the reformists, they are in general terms, not all of them. Some of them are actually very left-leaning economically, but generally they're more liberal. They're more, pro-capital. I don't mean capitalist, but they're more in that sort of direction. Mm-hmm. But they are more, let's say, they're more, let's say, some of them have more. They're more, let's say, I don't know. I don't want to say secular, because secular is a very problematic term. But they're more liberal in cultural issues. Let me put it that way. They're more liberal with regards to cultural issues and religion and so on. But they're also more pro-capitalist. Again, that's not a fair term to use, but they're more they're less left-leaning. They stress less on social justice and the impoverished. So it's not as if the conservatives are like the Republicans and the reformists are like the Democrats, even though the Republicans and the Democrats are more or less the same in many ways. So I don't know if I don't know if I made sense over the last 3-4 minutes, so I apologize.
No, it's very interesting, and I think important for U.S. viewers to understand that Iranian politics is more complex than what we have been told.
I don't understand Iranian politics, by the way. So,
what options does Iran have for retaliation at this point? That's the big question on everyone's mind. People are surprised in some ways that we haven't already seen an escalation, but it's always on the Iranians, of course, not to take that extra step. Where do you see things going? What are their options right now?
Well, you know, they say, and I don't mean this as an insult to fans of American football, but they say that Americans, and I mean American politicians and the American political establishment, they play football, and I know football is a sophisticated game. Again, I don't want to, you know, say something that will offend some people, but they say Americans play American football and Iranians play chess, meaning the Iranian political establishment, politicians, and I think that's to a large extent true. Trump, for example, by murdering General Soleimani and by murdering Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, he has weakened the U.S. position tremendously, and he has empowered Iran and Iraq and brought them closer to each other and strengthened each of these two countries internally in opposition to the United States. Now he can strut and brag and you know, regardless of the fact that he's committed a crime and he's murdered the people who actually defeated ISIS. It wasn't the Americans who defeated ISIS. It was these people and many thousands of Iraqis and Iranians and Syrians and Lebanese and others. But he can boast about it, and you know, Fox News or people in the United States, or even on CNN, they can say, yes, this guy, this Soleimani deserved death, but this wasn't the right thing to do. The narrative in the United States is completely detached from reality. But the fact is that this decision has hurt the United States, and I think it's only out of spite, since the Democrats hate Trump so much, that some of them are actually talking about this. Otherwise, if it wasn't Trump, they'd probably behave very differently. Because when it came to Syria, whenever Trump, you know, launched attacks against Syria, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats both, you know, were all for it.
And so was the media. Yes,
of course. Yes, of course. But right now, because the divide has become so deep, and also the impeachment and all, I think now some of the Democrats, not because for some moral reason, but because, in my opinion, maybe I'm being somewhat unfair, but because of their hatred for Trump, they are exposing the fact that this has been very damaging to the United States. I mean, the fact that the Iraqi parliament has called on U.S. troops to be expelled, I think that's very important. I think, and that's a direct result of what Trump did. If Trump had not murdered these people, we wouldn't have had this session of parliament today.
It is an incredible development. Do you believe this attack places the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or Iran deal in a different light? Was it wise for Iran to sign an agreement with the United States to begin with?
I was never a fan nor an opponent of the JCPOA, and I'm neither a fan of it nor an opponent of it today either. The JCPOA had advantages, and that was that it took away many of the American excuses and to demonize Iran. Iran was never pursuing a nuclear weapon at any point. And there's good evidence of that. If someone is really fair, and I know many in the United States would say, oh, this is propaganda, this guy is talking from Tehran, he can't talk, and whatever, I'm used to this. But, I mean, I think Gareth Porter has a good book on manufactured crisis, I think,
Mm-hmm.
the nuclear program, which he explains in detail. And I agree with 98% of the book. But the Americans were using the Iranian nuclear program as an excuse to harm ordinary Iranians. So the deal took away the excuse so that Obama could harm ordinary Iranians. But on the other hand, Iran gave more concessions than I think they could have. I think Iran was a bit too lenient.
What are some of the concessions you feel went too far?
Well, I think in some cases, with regards to the nuclear program, Iran gave too many concessions. But that's debatable. These are negotiations. When you buy a house and your husband or your father or your mother will say you bought it, it was too expensive. If you sell a house, they'll say, you sold it too cheap.
Right.
You're never going to be able to satisfy everyone. It's a deal. It was a deal. I'm not opposed to it or against it. I think it has its advantages, even now, in the sense that it has shown the international community that Iran's not the problem. It's the United States that's the problem. And I mean the government. I don't mean to offend Americans. It's the U.S. government that's the problem. And that has actually, despite the fact that the corporate media and the Western state media is very anti-Iran, but this is something that people have come to recognize, and Trump has helped through his crude behavior.
Do you think increasing enrichment capacity is on the table now as a result of this drastic escalation against Iran?
Well, I told someone, I've done so many interviews over the last couple of days, I don't know who I said this to. Someone asked me, do you think that what happened in Iraq will have an impact on Iran's commitments to the nuclear deal? And I said no, but apparently I'm wrong, because today the Iranians decided to further decrease their commitments as a result of what happened. So they were going to decrease their commitments a bit, but they decided to go a couple of extra steps, sort of in response to what the Americans did. But the Iranians still haven't left the deal. I mean, remember, the Americans, they tore the deal. The Europeans, they have been violating the deal from top to bottom, and the Iranians were in full compliance for a year and a half. Then, in order to put pressure on the Europeans to start complying, the Iranians have gradually been decreasing their commitments. But even now, this latest step that's going to be taken in the next couple of days, after this step is taken, Iran is still going to be fulfilling many of its commitments. In other words, for example, the monitoring that the International Atomic Energy Agency will be allowed to carry out, and their ability to see what's happening within the Iranian nuclear program, that is still in place. But Iran's research and technology and its ability to expand the nuclear program, Iran has set aside all limitations as of the next couple of days.
How closely are Iranians following the U.S. presidential election, and does it make a difference to them which party or which particular candidates are in power in Washington?
I think for a lot of Iranians, it does make a difference. They would like to see Trump out of office, but I think among politicians and those who, I guess, are a bit more informed about U.S. politics, and Iranians are pretty well informed about U.S. politics, more or less, I think that they really don't see much of a difference. So though the decision makers know that if a Democrat comes to power, he's not really going to do much, or she's not going to do much. Maybe Bernie Sanders, if he comes to power, he may be a bit different, but they're not very optimistic, because Bernie Sanders is more progressive with regards to internal issues, social justice and all that. But with regards to international affairs, he's not all that great. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard would be, way ahead of him on that, but she doesn't have any chance. But and also he would be a bit different. But the Senate and the House, they're so deeply embedded in the anti-Iran camp and the pro-Likud camp that I don't think someone like Sanders, even if he becomes president, can really do all that much.
Yes, it says a lot about the U.S. system. What was that?
or that he would really want to do all that much.
Right. Well, finally, my question for you is, what is your message as an Iranian to the U.S. public? We yesterday saw around 82 cities take to the streets and show solidarity with the Iranian people, stand up and say that the Trump administration and the U.S. government doesn't represent the people of this country. So what would you like to say to the U.S. public? What would you like them to understand about what's happening between our two countries right now?
Well, first, let me point out that I was born in the United States, so by law, I am an American citizen, although I've never received a, what's that? What is it called? The ID number, a social security number.
Security number, yeah.
I don't carry a passport, but and recently, last year, I was invited to Lebanon by the BBC to take part in a debate at AUB, the American University of Beirut campus. And then the BBC, and I accepted. Then the BBC later, a couple of days before the debate, they contacted me and said, we have a problem. AUB says you're not allowed on campus. And then later on, I found out the State Department threatened AUB with a big fine if I was allowed to participate. And the irony is that I was invited by the BBC. It wasn't as if I was invited by Hezbollah or something, or Hamas. Right. Yeah, so I was invited by the good guys, the BBC, the pro-Western, media outlets. But so I complained well, it's a long story. Ultimately, I made some trouble. I contacted people in Lebanon. There were student demonstrations, and the BBC decided to keep me and change the venue, even though they lost some money because they set up a tent on campus. But I sort of pressured them. I said, you can have someone instead of me, but you can't stay on that campus, otherwise I'll cause trouble. Anyway, they did the right thing. They had the debate outside of campus, and they invited me, and I participated. But the thing was that I told all my Western reporter friends about this. No one reported it. Even the BBC did not say what happened. And when I tweeted about it, none of these reporters even retweeted it. And I was saying that, look, I was born in the United States. This violates my First Amendment rights. But when it comes to evil, I'm not even considered as an American because I support the Iranians against the U.S. policy. I guess that makes you un-American, or in the eyes of many. But the point that I want to say is that I was 16 when I volunteered to fight in the war against Iraq. I was a volunteer. I quit school.
Wow.
And I survived 2 chemical attacks during those years. I was shot, and I have shrapnel wounds. And the US government supported Saddam Hussein back then. And before going to the war, before the revolution, actually, since I was brought up in the United States till I was 12 or 13, I thought very differently about the United States. But when I came to Iran, and especially when I saw what the United States had done to Iran and was doing to Iran, and how the United States was providing Saddam Hussein with the weapons that they did, I began to see the US government in a very different light. And I think that the only way to bring about change is for Americans to put aside this sense of exceptionalism, something which both Republicans and Democrats have. And when you see yourself as exceptional, then anything that you do is interpreted in a different light. So if when the United States commits war crimes in Libya, these are not crimes, these are mistakes. So the Iranians are evil, they murder people, but the Americans commit mistakes. So when Bush is, after he's murdered 1 million Iraqis, he becomes best friends with Michelle Obama. Why? Because Americans don't commit crimes. Obama is a great guy. He's really funny on talk shows. He's cool. But he's killed hundreds of thousands of people in Yemen and Syria through his policies. These are war criminals. But many Americans can't see it that way because they take personal offense. They think that if you say that the US government is committing war crimes, that these people should be in jail, they should be on death row, they take it personally. Iranians don't dislike the American people. When you hear them say death to the United States, they mean the US government. And that's actually what the Iranian leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, just a few weeks ago said very explicitly. He says this has nothing to do with the United States of America. This has to do with US imperialism. It's like Yankee go home. Yankee go home doesn't mean anyone who has an American passport should get lost out of, get out of Latin America. It means the US government. It means the US military. It means the US, those who are supporting the right-wing regimes and militias in Latin America and so on. So if Americans could recognize that Iranians an Iranian society is a normal society, but they have many grievances against the United States, and that the United States has caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iranians through the war that they supported, Saddam Hussein's war. And the United States has caused the deaths of a million of Iraqis and hundreds of thousands of Syrians and hundreds of thousands of Yemenis. If the American people could recognize this and see it for what it is, then I think we will have great change and the world will become a better place. But as long as they look at the world from an exceptionalist position, then the crimes that their government commits are no longer crimes, and whatever other countries do against their government, that would be barbaric and inhumane and worthy of punishment. And that, I think, is a big part of the problem.
I can say that whether it's Syria, Honduras, Venezuela, any of the countries I visited over the last year, that's the very common message. The U.S. government, we don't see the U.S. government as the U.S. people. We love the U.S. people. They just ask us, please stop waging an economic war against our country. Stop threatening our government with regime change. Let us live in peace and as sovereign people. And I think that's a fair enough request. And so I'm going to keep doing this show and staying in touch with you, Professor Marandi, so that we can get this information out to the U.S. public and hope to make that change. So thank you so much again for your time this evening. I know you're very busy. Where can viewers follow you very quickly?
I don't know. Where can they follow me? In what way? In what sense?
Twitter. Is like Twitter
yes,
a good way to stay up to date with your writings and work?
I'm not very good at Twitter, but I do have a Twitter account. It's at S_M_M_MARANDI. But I'm not all that active. I just put up my interviews, or some of the interviews that are on YouTube. Well,
they're always excellent interviews, so thanks again.
Well, thank you for having me, and I wish you all the best, and I hope to speak to you soon, and let's hope for better days ahead.
We certainly will. Thanks again so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.